This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
All right, there it goes. All right. Good morning. Are there any questions on the peer reviews? Anything? 7 things have to be submitted unless you're only a group of 2, then fewer things, 5 things. All right. Let me know if you have any questions. Has anybody managed to get her or his head around how the marking is going to go? It's nice and confusing. Try marking it. It gets even more confusing. All right, here's where we are in the semester. Down here in week 9. And so you should be thinking about your peer reviews. They're all going to go in next week when we start thinking about surveys and instruments, data collection instruments of various sorts. So, and then a couple weeks later, week 12-ish, 25th of May, your assignment 2C will come in. So hopefully everybody's got their head around that. Today is a volunteer-based tutorial, so hopefully everybody's got their head around that. All right, so we're, like I said last week, we're about an hour behind. We didn't get to our, we got to quasi-experimental design last week. All this is fine. What I want to hit today is sampling on the quantitative side and sampling on the qualitative side. So this is a bridge back to the qualitative work from where we've been in the quantitative space. So hopefully we'll find our way somehow. Starting with the quantitative parts. So we did all this last week, assignment 2A. And we need to start here. So, when we're talking about confirmatory research, there are a lot of different kinds of confirmatory research, but one of them is quantitative, statistical analysis. Probably the most popular kind, the kind we think of a lot when we think of confirmatory research. So we've got an issue with sampling and when we do quantitative research. So I want to talk today about why we sample and what sampling gives us in a quantitative setting. Then we'll talk about sampling in a qualitative setting. So one of the processes we use to understand something about a population, which we're going to get to, is a technique called statistics. Now, we're not learning any statistics, not much statistics in this class, almost none. But statistics is the process of inferring something about a population based on a sample. And so that sample becomes a really important part of the reliability and validity of our results. If we don't get the sample right, we lose the possibility of trusting, reasonably trusting, the findings. So when you see your thesis examination and you see how much of the score is dedicated to the methodological approach, you'll understand why, because it's about making sure we've got the right process so that when we get to the end, we have some faith that what we found has some reasonable representation of what's actually occurring. So statistics is that process where we infer something about a bigger group from a smaller group. So we call these, there are two ways, two sets of language around statistics. So for the mean, for the average, of a set of numbers. We have our population mean, the true mean. There is some mean out there. The problem is we can never observe it, almost never. So if we have a census, we do actually observe a true mean. We observe the average household income for the metropolitan area. And we know that because we counted everybody, or functionally everybody, and we averaged their incomes and we got a number, and that number is known. But there are lots of other things where we're trying to understand something about a population, and we can't sample the whole population. How satisfied are you with a housing program? How much money do you earn after participating in an after-school program as a high school student compared to not? Lots of things that we don't have the whole population to sample. We don't have the whole population to observe. So when we're in that situation, we're in a sample space. And that mean is called something different. In a statistics setting, it's called X bar. So they're both representations of the mean, of the average, but X bar refers to a sample. Mu, the Greek letter mu, refers to the population. So in statistics, this is what we do. We generalize from a sample to a population. So a sample is a subset of the population. It can be a big subset, can be a small subset. The population is basically a census. So we want to specifically infer things about characteristics of the population which are reasonably fixed, meaning at any given point in time they have a number, they have a value, they have a truth. If you are measuring something that's measurable that way. But it's unknown. We can't observe it. Or it would be very expensive to observe it. It's not even necessarily reliable to observe it. And we want to find characteristics of a sample, X bar, S for standard deviation, P sub S for probability of a sample, as opposed to mu, sigma, and P sub U, which would be the proportion of a population. So when you're doing your assignments, you've got to know what you're doing. Do you have a population? Do you have a census? Or do you have a sample? And if you have a sample, what do you have to do to convince your reader and yourself that that sample is a good enough representation of this truth that you're looking to discover? That we should trust what you say about your research. So those parameters, those things about the population. So parameters are observations about the population, the mean of the population, the standard deviation, their proportion. We're not getting into what those mean. We do that in urban demography and statistics. It's a good follow-on to this subject if you're interested in statistics. But what we're trying to do is take those sample statistics and use them as a window to look at this bigger thing that's happening in our world. So I think it's a good idea for even people who aren't studying statistics to know the difference between what we call descriptive statistics and inferential statistics. So many theses, when students are really starting out on a research project, they are inclined to this descriptive kind of setting. We're just going to describe something. We're going to talk about what it is, what's going on. So descriptive statistics are, they give you, things like typical and ranges of values. So monthly rents for analytical methods students, for instance. Inferential statistics, that's the process of generalizing from a sample back to your population. So when we say statistics, it really means two things. Descriptive statistics are just the numbers that come out of a statistical process. They are, so we use the interquartile range or the mean or the median. Those are technical terms that describe a statistic, a number that we get out of a mathematical process on some observations. But inferential statistics, that's the process of generalizing from the sample to the population. So you really want to have a good sense of what you are doing when you use statistics. So we want to, as I said, apply sample statistics to make inferences about the population. So we want to know, for our little n, our sample, we maybe want to infer how many people are in the population. So sometimes we don't even know how many people there are. And there are interesting statistical ways to estimate people. Just a simple population. Sometimes in informal settlements, for instance, we don't know how many people are in an informal settlement. Or we don't know how many frogs are in a pond. So there are statistical ways, we're not going to get into them, to infer that. We may want to know, this should be x bar, the mean of a population, and we look for the mean of the sample. And similarly with the standard deviation. Well, the important thing for us is that statistics are used in the process of hypothesis testing. So statistics are not an outcome of research. They are a tool used in the process of research. They're one tool, one of many. You don't have to use them. They're not even the most powerful explanatory tools necessarily, but they are a tool. And when we use statistics, it's very useful to also think about our design, our research design. Because not all problems in research can be solved with statistical processes. It's sometimes better to design the threats to validity out of your problem, out of your research, if you can. So by definition, all statistical tests are hypothesis tests. We've talked about the null hypothesis, or I'm sorry, we will talk about the null hypothesis. We've talked about quasi-experimental designs. We've talked about the need for a hypothesis. If you are running a statistical process, if you are computing an average, if you are computing a standard deviation, you have a hypothesis. And this is by definition, because statistics require a hypothesis. Any statistical process, a regression, a multivariate regression, a very fancy regression, an analysis of variance, all statistical tests are by definition a test of a hypothesis. So that means you need to be really clear about what your hypothesis is. So let's think about Maya Doherty's hypothesis. She was interested in knowing whether accessibility to parks, where there's a differentiation between big parks and small parks and nearness and being far away, was associated with the incidence of non-communicable diseases. So she asked, her hypothesis was that people who have good access to parks are healthier. And the way that she operationalized that idea of health was to look at hospital admissions per capita in an LGA. And the reason she did that was because that's the data she had. And she found no effect. So she had a hypothesis, and she used a statistical process to test the hypothesis, and she found that her hypothesis was not supported with her statistical data. So, whenever we're doing any statistical analysis, it's very smart to set up a null hypothesis framework. So Maya's null hypothesis was the opposite of her hypothesis, where her hypothesis was people who have good access to parks are healthier than people who have poorer access to parks. So that we denote with an H1. And then the converse of that, it's not really a converse, a logical converse, the opposite of that, the null hypothesis, that's the thing that we're forced to accept if our hypothesis turns out to not be true. So this is the thing that we're forced to accept that Maya Doherty was forced to accept when her hypothesis turned out to not be supported. And that is, there's no effect. People who have good access to parks are not any healthier than people who have poor access to parks. So the statistical outcome will support one of these. So the way that this worked for Maya's analysis was that she tested across a range of LGAs in the metropolitan area something about the average, something about that X bar. She was looking at whether the average hospital admission for an SLA, I guess I said LGA, it was SLAs. SLA, if you remember, is one of the old census geographies that no longer exists, which is frustrating. Her unit of analysis was the SLA. She had an indicator, hospital admissions for non-communicable diseases per capita, index to the population, per capita multiplied by 10,000, just to make the number more easy to read, because very few people out of the general population are hospitalized for non-communicable disease. Lots of people, but still a small proportion of the population. And she had a statistical test and was testing whether the average proportion of hospital admissions for SLAs with strong access to parks versus the average proportion of hospital admissions for SLAs with weak access to parks. So that was her distinction. So she had a post-test only design with a control group. She had one wave of data, 2016, and she had one intervention, strong access to parks. So this has a quasi-experimental design with some threats to validity, but observing a control group that didn't have access to parks. So what this, we still have some threats to validity in this setup, because we don't know if those places started with hospital admissions that were higher for some reason that maybe didn't have to do with the parks. Maybe it had to do with something else. So some of her statistical processes allowed her to control for things like education levels. But by and large, this is the model that she designed and wrote up in her thesis. If we're looking at our project on activity centers, we defined this idea of influence areas. And we said if the place is within the influence area of an activity center, and we defined what that meant. And some activity centers had more influence area because they were metropolitan centers, as opposed to neighborhood centers, which had a smaller reach. And you could take all kinds of issue with this. You could say, well, influence is not just about space and distance, Jenny. And why do we think that the Bayside and the Glen Ira centers have the same kind of influence? I think all of that is very reasonable. This is why it's really important to be very clear about what you have done, so that other people could say, I can do that better, and then go and do it better. So if we didn't find an effect, which we didn't, you might say, I can do that in a way that is a little more true to what I think is occurring. So maybe I use the road network instead of a straight line distance. Maybe I'm more subtle about how influence area gets defined. All that is fine. So every time you write something up, it should be toward giving the other person enough information to reproduce what you've done. So we we know that our observations over time offer more defenses against those threats to validity that we started to outline last week. So I said when we were talking about this project that it's possible that the entire region is gaining or losing jobs housing balance. It's time. But that this setup does help with that threat to validity. And that it's also possible that something other than our policy is causing the fluctuation. But again, our multiple time periods and our study area of the whole metropolitan area helps guard against that threat to validity. Let's take our 1-minute break. So this is why research design is purposeful. This is why you can't do it in 2 weeks before the assignment is due. Because you should really be laboring over your design. Have I got this right? Have I designed out all the threats to validity? If not, have I explained it to my reader? We don't expect a student who's in first or second year of a master's degree to have thought of everything. That's why there's supervision. But I want you to make a good effort to think through some of the problems that arise in research design. When we did, so our unit of analysis was, again, the SLA, a frustratingly gone spatial unit from the census. Our indicator was something called jobs housing balance, and that was a measurement that looks like this. Greek letters, don't panic, italics, I understand, little and subscripts. It's fine, don't worry, I'm not going to test you on this. What this means is people live close to where they work, or they work close to where they live. This is the mathematical representation of that. And we were testing whether average jobs housing balance were of strongly impacted SLAs, so places that had a lot of activity center influence, were different than the average jobs housing balance of places that were only weakly impacted by activity center policies. So strong versus weak. This is obviously strong. Maybe that space right there is really strong. It's got like a double impact. There are some places nearby that are quite weak in their influence. So in order to do this kind of work, in order to think about our research design, we do need to know something about the kinds of data we work with. So there are multiple kinds of variables that we deal with. One is nominal variables. So these are places that are either or. So there are a lot of variables where maybe they're overly simplified, but we treat them like they're quite simple things. So a place is typically either zoned commercial, residential, industrial, or some other zoning. There's the mixed-use zoning. You could call that a complexity, but it is a type of zoning. Sex is often considered to be a one or the other. You're either female or you aren't. Now, again, that's becoming a more complicated thing. It's always been more complicated, but it's becoming acknowledged to be more complicated. One's ancestry, where they came from in the world. Nominal variables, either ors. Ordinal variables are things that have a ranking. So attitudes, 1 to 5. Many of you have probably been asked in the past, how do you feel about something? Rank this 1 to 5. How do you feel about your instructor? 1 to 5. So attitudes are one way we deal with ordinal variables. There are also others, ones that have an expression of degree. So maybe distance, inner, middle, and outer ring suburbs. That's an ordinal variable. It's different than meters from the CBD or kilometers from the CBD, because kilometers from the CBD is different from the inside of the inner ring and the outside of the inner ring. But inner just is one or the other. Types of office space, level of service of traffic, pollutant levels, those sorts of things. There's some distance, some meaningful distance between categories. And then we have interval and ratio variables. And those are things like height and weight and distance, and the Richter scale, and income and age, things that are measured at fine, minute levels. So that's different than, say, inner, middle, and outer ring, because it's much more precise. And we also have ratio variables. Those are a subset of interval variables that are normalized against something else. So a percentage is a good example of a ratio variable. Percent of the population under 30. So we take our number of people under 30 and we divide it by the total population. Because the total population is different everywhere, this puts all the places on a comparable level. So in terms of strength, nominal variable, if you can work with ratio variables and interval variables, they're really good because they give you a high level of precision, presuming that they're collected well and there's good sampling. Ratio variables especially, because a percentage is much more, it tells us a bit more than a simple number of people under 30, because that number of people under 30 doesn't tell us how many people out of they're drawn out of. So if there are 10,000 people, it's different than if there are 100,000 people. If you can't get ratio data, interval data works. Ordinal data and then nominal data. So in terms of the power of explanation, we do try to work as much as we can in the ratio and interval space. But we're often forced to work with nominal data, like our census comes at us in nominal data. So when we're choosing, and again, this is just a little beyond the scope of the subject, but I would like you to just have it in your mind that there are a variety of statistical tests. If you want to test some of these relationships, it does depend on the kind of data that you have. So if you have nominal data or ordinal data, you can do certain cross tabulations. If you have nominal data and interval data, you can run an analysis of variance. If you have interval and ratio data, you can do correlations and regressions. So this is maybe a bit beyond what, not maybe, definitely a little bit beyond what we're covering here. But it's important to know that depending on the kind of data you're planning on collecting or you're able to get, you've got different options for your statistical tests that you're going to use. So where that data comes from, if you're collecting what we call primary data, you're collecting your own data, then you can control whether it's ordinal or categorical, nominal, interval, or ratio. So you can control whether you're going to ask people to tell you whether they fit into one of 6 income categories, or you're going to ask them to report their exact income. And that often has to do with how much we think we can get them to answer. Some people don't really know, especially in lots of developing countries, the income is not a regular annual thing. It's really hard to get people to report on their income. Primary data, so that's data collected by the researcher. Secondary data is basically data that's collected by someone else. So that's from the census or wherever you get data. The Maya Doherty's disease data was not collected by her. Somebody else did that. So we use primary data. If you can, it's a good idea for sanity, for time, for cost. It's a good idea to rely on somebody else's data, because we pay these public agencies lots of money to do very comprehensive data collection. So if it's possible to answer your question with secondary data, then that's a good idea. There's no shame in using the census. Lots and lots of very good research is done, which is why we continue to invest in it as a society. But it's possible that primary data is required because secondary data just can't give you what you want to know. Or it's out of date, or it's not available, even if it does exist. So I did a project when I was a PhD student on whether people who had been forced to move out of the middle of Shanghai were better off or worse off than people who had moved voluntarily to the same place. And the Chinese census does have information on household expenditures, even movement and migration around the city, so you know where people moved 5 or 10 years before. But it does not have data, did not at the time, I'm not sure if it does now, did not at the time have data on whether they moved voluntarily or whether they were forced to move. And so I didn't have the option with that question of using secondary data. Just not an option. Now, I could have devised another question that used the available secondary data. And sometimes that's what people do. They go, I've got this great data set. What questions can I ask from this data set? And lots of great projects have been raised that way. But if your question requires you to collect your own data, you've got special considerations that you're going to have to deal with. A former student of mine, Bryn Davies, he asked the question whether he wanted to know whether people in new suburbs, he was looking particularly at Craigieburn, which is a newer suburb at that time, when they were purchasing a home, did they consider fuel price changes in the package of goods that were the home and travel? And the census, for instance, and most of the travel surveys don't ask people whether they considered fuel prices in their home ownership decision, in their home purchase decision. So he had to go door to door in Craigieburn and get people to participate in his survey. So for Bryn, he wanted to know about people in Craigieburn. So he had a population. He had all the people in Craigieburn that he wanted to know something about. And then, in order to understand something about that population, he used statistical inferences, which meant that he had to generate a sample. So his two options were go and find the whole population and find out about them, get them to participate, or use a sample to infer something about that larger population. So his sampling frame, so sampling is that process. Sampling, and when you write up your assignment, you're going to want to be thinking about sampling. How did I find my sample? So our sampling process is that process by which it's the guiding process by which we draw that sample so that it's got statistical validity. And our sampling frame may be some, I'm actually going to come back to this. I'll come back to this in a few minutes, the sampling frame, because we'll keep talking about population for a minute. So populations do not have to be everybody. So the population doesn't have to be everybody in Craigieburn. Yes, is it time? The population isn't everybody necessarily. It's the entire body of people or frogs or whatever that you're interested in. So it could be all people in a metro area. It could be people in outer suburbs. It could be people who moved involuntarily. It could be people who are dependent on transit. It doesn't have to even be geographically based. People who are dependent on transit live all over the place. It could be small business owners. So your population is some subset of the entire population, some subset of the world that, that represents the body of people that you want to know about. So our sampling frame then is that subset of the total population that represents the people that you want to sample. So all the people in a metro area. It could be that you just decide that you want to know about the entire metropolitan region. It's ambitious because it takes you need a reasonably good sampling process to understand an entire metropolitan area. But these are the things that you need to think about. So sampling is really important because, as Max Offhammer, one of my PhD supervisors, used to say, garbage in, garbage out. If your sampling process is junk, your results are junk. Or probably more accurately, if your sampling process is junk, we have no idea whether your results are junk or not. So we have to presume they are. So the things that we're trying to ensure are representativeness. How well does your sample represent the characteristics of your population? And bias, the deviance from representativeness that can come from things like low response rates, choosing the wrong sampling frame, bad or misleading questions, non-response error. Sometimes you don't get enough people responding, and that creates the possibility of bias. So when we're doing in the social sciences, we also struggle with producing samples that meet the strictest criteria for randomness. So we actually have there are different kinds of samples. And so I'm going to go through different sampling strategies, and this is going to help with how you sample. So the gold standard, if we could do it all the time, we do a pure random sample. That means that every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. So we've got a great master list of everybody in my population, everybody who's a transit dependent, everybody who lives in the outer suburbs, and we can very easily pluck them out of our big bin and look at the name, and then we chuck it back in. Because in a pure random sample, we have replacement. That means we could pick that person again. When Apple first released iTunes, how many of you still using iTunes? A few people. They had a random process for the random song generator. And then when people started getting the same song 2 or 3 times, they got annoyed because they didn't want to hear the same song again. And they thought there was some bias in the sampling process. What actually was happening was replacement. Random chance brought that song up again. So there are lots of reasons why this is not very useful. For instance, if you're doing a medical trial, drawing a person out of the population, you can't put them back in and then give them the same medical treatment again. There are a whole bunch of ethical problems with that, right? It also makes less sense to survey someone twice about their travel behavior. It's also really tricky because we don't have those kinds of master lists of people. So if you are sampling people from who are working at a mall, or using a train service or a transit parking lot, you're going to really struggle to get a random sample. So you shouldn't declare that you have a random sample, because you don't. And most social scientists have entirely given up on trying to achieve random samples. The second kind of sample is a simple random sample. So that's the same as a random sample. You still need that master list. You still need to have some random sampling process. But you don't replace. So now you can't hear the same song again. And the simple random sample approximates the pure random sample if the sample is really small compared to the normal population. So if we have a population of 1 million and our sample is 400, they're more or less the same. The simple random sample, because your chance of getting that person again, that person you've thrown back into the mix, is unlikely in a large population. But again, simple random sampling is something we don't achieve very often in social sciences.
How does the replacement happen?
Depends. So obviously, I mean, when we sample, let's say we wanted to call 10,000 people and ask them their opinion on a poll. We'd draw one out. We'd call. What's your opinion? Yes. Thank you very much. And then we'd allow that person's phone number to come up again. So it might be that it's computer generated. It might be a big bingo vat of numbers. It's almost never done in the social sciences. It's done in mathematical simulation. It's easier. We're more likely to do something we call systematic sampling. So if you're interested in, for instance, in people's experience riding a train, most people will go and find people riding a train. But our problem with walking onto a train platform and either observing people or asking them what they think is bias, our own bias. So I might be more comfortable talking to women than men. So if I just pick whoever I want, I might find that 75% of my sample are women. That would be fine if 75% of the platform, the people on the platform are women, but we know that's probably not the case. I might find that I'm more comfortable talking with brown-haired women than blonde-haired women, or women who wear flat shoes versus heel shoes. We have no idea what our biases are sometimes. I might know that about myself, I might not. So one way we try to, I might also feel uncomfortable approaching someone who looks like she's in a hurry or who looks impatient. There are lots of reasons why we would bring bias. So instead of what we do is we discipline ourselves. We say, okay, I'm going to do a systematic sample. So this means that every fifth person who walks past this place where I'm sitting, I'm going to ask, regardless of whether it's a blonde woman in stilettos or a young man, doesn't matter. I'm going to ask him, unless it's a child. Maybe we say something like that. So we just take every kth entry, every certain frequency. This is what I did with my doctoral research. So he said, right, there are 600 apartment buildings. Every one of them has 20 floors. We're going to go to every so many floors and take every so manyth apartment. And we scrambled the numbers so that we didn't get all corner units or units by the elevator or anything like that. So for this, it adds an element of systematicness that allows us to control for our own bias, our own propensity to skew the sample in a way that maybe we're comfortable or something. Not independent of that idea of systematic sampling, sometimes these are related, stratified sampling. So I also used stratified sampling in my study. So it might be that we're really interested in two populations, or three subsets of a population. People who live in the inner ring suburbs versus the middle ring versus the outer ring. So in that case, we might want to go and find some people in the inner ring, in the middle ring, and in the outer ring. Rather than random sampling, we might want to specifically target people in each geography. So that we have one reason we do that is to get a sample that's reasonably evenly sized between the control group and the treatment group. So a former student of mine, Xin Yang, current student of mine still a student of mine after 7 or 8 years, now she's finishing her PhD, she was interested in the Melbourne Bike Share program. That was back when it was new and there weren't other competitors. And what she found was that there were so few people using the Melbourne Bike Share that if she just randomly sampled people walking around campus, her population were university students, that she would never get more than 1 or 2 people who had used it. So she had to stratify and specifically target individuals who had used the Melbourne Bike Share program because it was a small population. So to find small populations, we're often forced to do stratification. And then you can do some kind of sampling within each strata. So you can randomly sample within a strata, within one of the divisions, or you can systematically sample within each strata. But when we're doing stratified sampling, we're seeking to get something like the same number of individuals. So if you've got a total sample of 1,500 in each of 2 strata. Another example from my experience is trying to find people who had resettled to an adjacent slum. They're actually harder to find than people who live in the slum, right? Because they're a subset of the population. So we had to go looking for people especially who had done that. So this is my PhD research. This was Shanghai in 2006. The built-up area, it's now bigger. And more of this is also built up. But I had 4 communities, or 4 areas that I was interested in that were at the urban-rural interface. And I was interested in finding people who lived there. So it didn't make any sense to randomly sample from the entire city in the hopes of getting the people who lived here. The population is far more dense in the central city. And it made much more sense to go and do something more targeted, a stratified sample. So we also have this possibility of clustered sampling, which is a bit different than stratified sampling. And we're not going to really, again, we have to just stop somewhere. But we're not going to spend too much time on that in here. The pros and cons of the different kinds of sampling are summarized here. So random sampling and systematic sampling give you lower probability of bias because you can't discriminate. You can't go, oh, I'm kind of afraid to walk up to that person. Oh, she's just too good looking. Oh, you know, whatever it is. Random sampling doesn't give you that option. Stratified sample, we do attempt to control that, but again, if we're sampling every Kth person, the systematic sampling process allows us to try to control for that a little more, but again, we're still subject to our own biases. Stratified sampling is a very good way to ensure that we get representation from some sort of subsample. But for all of these, for random sampling, sometimes for systematic sampling and sometimes for stratified sampling, we do need some sort of master list. Sometimes we don't. It depends on what our population looks like. But we're always striving for trying to reduce the amount of discretion that we use in the selection of our sample. So whenever we can, we stay toward the upper end of this table in the random sampling space or systematic sampling. When we need to, we go to stratified sampling, but we should have a very, very clear reason for doing that. So when you're thinking about your sample, I'd like you to think about what do you need to do? Is it possible to sample from a higher order in this table, from a higher row in this table, or do I need to get down to a stratified sample? Either way, it's fine. You just need to justify it. So let's see. It's probably time. It's a good time to break. We're not going to go too much into the descriptive statistics. I had this as extra content in case we had extra time, but we have less time.
Actual question.
Oh, actual question. Sure.
With your sampling, can you, through the period of research, like analyze what you have sampled, and then in a sense maybe look at doing more systematic sampling? So if you find that you've got a skew or a bias, so if you're doing on-screen interviews, and
Yeah.
you find that you're creating a skew or a bias in your own, then can you then create systematic sampling to try and reduce that skew or bias? Does that make sense?
It's better to do that than not do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
It's an acceptable way to try and lower the skew or bias.
The best thing to do is to not have a skew or a bias.
But you might not see that until you've started to analyze.
Yes. So let's say you just go out and you're like, I'm just going to ask whoever I think would want to participate. And then halfway through, you're like, oh, this is really producing a lot of, a sample with a whole bunch of one sort of feature. At that point, what I would do if I were in that situation is I would go, I'm going to correct myself and start a systematic sampling process. And then I'm going to distinguish the earlier surveys from the later surveys with a little signal in my data set that says, these people were gathered before I started my systematic process. These people I sampled after I started my systematic process. And then I'd do analysis with them all combined, and I'd do analysis with them separate and see if there was any difference. So that's one way that we kind of try to decode bias.
Where you want to try and get a sampling, a full sampling of
Representative?
purposes.
Purposive sampling?
Yeah,
Okay.
so if you want to do a sampling so that you get a proper geographical spread, in a sense, but then you'll find these, so you then do more sampling in a certain geographical area. So is that
Right.
just...
So then you've switched your population, right? You've gone from, so let's say you do some random sampling and you're like, oh, it's really interesting in Craigieburn. Now I'm going to zero in on Craigieburn.
No, I was saying if you're trying to do lots of areas, but you found that you've just got lots of data for Craigieburn, but you also want Broadmeadows and somewhere else.
The question is, how did you get all that area for all that data for Craigieburn? Are you somehow drawn to people who live in Craigieburn? Is it something about the people you know? Is it something about your sampling process? Because, yeah, that will give you a sense of what you've introduced to that process that created it. If it just happens to be that you live in Craigieburn, then, and that's where you are most of the time. Now, sometimes that's going to, what that does is then you can kind of rethink your study, right? If you're like, well, clearly I had this biased sampling process and it got me 99% of my people or people who live in the northern suburbs for some reason. You can start to think, okay, now I've got a different problem. I might add a geographic scoping to my question so that I don't get caught out with a non-representative sample. But if you, so yeah, that would be that kind of moment to correct yourself. And then again, what I would do is I would redesign my sampling. If I were getting, now it's possible if I were I would redesign my sample, so my sampling process, so that I don't keep getting that same bias again. But it is possible. It's a low probability event, but it's possible that I would randomly sample from the metropolitan area of Melbourne, and 70% of my people would be from Craigieburn. It's a weird sample. It's not likely to happen, but every sample. So if you flip a coin an infinite number of times, there are going to be blocks where there are 1 million heads in a row. That's, they do Monte Carlo simulations of this, right? Like a computer simulations. So it happens. It just happens sometimes. Sometimes you're going to randomly sample 1,000 people from the metro area, and they're all going to be from Craigieburn. It's weird. It happens. Statistics is not a guarantee. Using good statistics is not a guarantee that you're going to not have an event like that. It just reduces the chances that you're going to have an event like that. So even if you do it the best way you can, there's still a possibility you'll have a very biased, skewed sample, but you have a much better chance of having a representative sample if you use good sampling techniques. Purposive sampling is more of a qualitative technique. We're going to talk about that next. After a 5-minute break. It's 12:01. Let's come back at 12:00. We'll say 12:06. Let's say 12:07. That way we get a full 5 minutes. Slide 22.
The study that I'm looking at on identity, I'm trying to make sure that there's a mix of long-term and short-term residents, and that there's a mix of residents potentially overlapping the geographic being suburbs. And this means that, and I already have, so there's a structure to do to sort of get the demographic, and then a semi-structure to do to find it. And the structure really gives a demographic profile, so we can look to see whether we're just collecting the data from a certain profile, which will skew the semi-structured outcome. Does that make sense? And so that was the purpose of this one. So I could just interview everyone around Bourke Street if they identify in that area, but that's not the suburb, it's just Bourke Street.
So it's a suburb of Melbourne, the whole is the geographic area?
Yes.
And it's about identity of what?
Locational identities. So whether they have different locational identities within the suburb of Melbourne. So, and that's why purpose, because you have to move your street reviews if you're around the suburb of Melbourne.
It sounds like you're trying to do something quantitative with a qualitative process.
So quantitative is to make sure that the data isn't just skewed to one demographic. So maybe like, so it's only like it all comes from one sort of demographic area in the suburb of Melbourne, or potentially we only find people who live in the society, and people who live in Melbourne long, may have a different identity. So it's sort of those two parts, trying to get the demographic profile to see whether that skews the semi-structured interview, which is about identity. We don't know whether it exists in terms of structure, they are free to give their idea of the identity, so they don't create a bias by the questions.
Maybe it's, How would you say
I
it?
have no idea. I just read it out of it. Like, in reading it, I haven't said that loud. So,
Yeah, there are some things that like pasty. I have no idea how to say that in American.
more of an action.
Would it be a pasty?
Tasty is when you just don't get out. Like a student in the winter.
But be careful because with a small number of interviews, I think you're really bordering on a quantitative framework. You know, where if we use qualitative work to drive like why, to create the causal mechanism. So if you want to know how people identify, that's quantitative. So I am a Melbourneian or I'm not.
Well, yeah, but see, so when you live in Melbourne, you have a second identity. Okay, so
Yes.
like New Yorker, if you come from New York, you're Upper West Side, East Side, Soho, Tribeca. You see how there's sort of two, you're a New Yorker or you're,
Yeah.
if you live in the southern Melbourne, you're a Melbourneian and you're does it exist? I don't think it does, but I can't say that. So it's a exploratory because I don't actually know if people have started identifying.
But you can have a hypothesis that people are so.
So mine was
All you need to do is uncover in a qualitative setting. All you need to do is uncover that exists in some people, right? So you would use a qualitative study to kind of go, do some people have another identity, and how is that constructed?
Yeah.
And the qualitative part is how is that constructed? Whether or not it exists widely in the population is a quantitative question. So if you want to take your interviews, then you've created a quantitative question. If you want to put things on
So it doesn't matter what the identities are, it's just that they have identities.
it depends on, you might want to know, you might want to say like, Fitzroy's an identity or Inner West or whatever. If I were doing a study like this, I would either look to establish there's a certain proportion of the population that has some other kind of identity, or in the first instance, you might just look to find people who do have another kind of identity, and yeah, that would be qualitative, but that would be not a 17% of people have this, or it would be more like how is it constructed?
Yeah, and that is the gist of it. The structured demographic profile is to make sure that you don't have a skew or bias in the population.
Yeah, but you don't need to be representative. So qualitative work does not need to be representative of space. So it doesn't need to be demographically representative and spatially representative. All it needs to do is establish that this occurs in some populations. And, so if you found 10 people and you found that there were 10 different ways of identifying among those 10 people, you've still answered the question.
So then we could further studies to then break that identities down. Just to be looking to see the identities.
Yes, so if you want to know, so the problem with designing a survey right away is that you are immediately testing hypotheses. Do you have an inner north identity? Do you have a Footscray identity? Do you have a western or south of the river identity? So you might just ask them, which of these appeals to you? And you have like 50 options, right? And that would be very quantitative, and then you'd be able to say things like, people who lived in Melbourne for a long time have different identity structures than people who lived in Melbourne for a short time. But if you were doing qualitative work, first, what I want to know is like, to design that survey at all, I'd be like, but how do you know what to put on the survey?
Well, that's why we use the city structure face-to-face interview on random street interviews. And we question them all so that they didn't leave people to an answer in a sense that made them feel.
Yeah, which I love, but I wouldn't require spatial representation for that. What I would require is that instead of focusing on things that are yes/no, which I could do in a survey, I don't need an interview for that. I need an interview to understand. Basically, what I'm trying to understand is how would I phrase my survey question? What I eventually went and did in some other studies sometime in the future, what needs to be on there? And the exploratory part is the part that would allow us to identify those things.
Okay, so since since that's quantitative, and then qualitative would be next step. So look at that. If they don't exist, then you can't do that.
Yeah, so, well, I guess if you know what to put on that survey, you know, is inner north and inner west and inner east and inner south and outer north, is that the right representation for identity? If you don't even know what metropolitan identity is, if there's no research on that, if you can't form a hypothesis around it, then decoding that from interviews would be the way I go. So if you do not need a sample of 400 and to get like, you might say, oh, I sampled only people who've been in Melbourne longer than 15 years because they're the one. So another study, another time, or maybe we have a stratified sample of long-time residents and newer residents, and we're trying to.
But I don't have to try and create this entire sampling CV to just see whether these things exist. It doesn't matter if they just exist.
Not only do they exist, but what is the construction of that existence? So, not like when you do qualitative work, it's pretty boring to just go yes or no. You might as well just have a survey. It's why? Where did that come from? What does it look like when you think about your identity as a? Tell me the places that you
And that's what,
that.
so Zootron is coding it so that you can get a unit. In other words, they use the beans and then break it down into you get these sort of identities that is
And you might come up with like 4 identity types that seem to make sense out of your sample. And you'd say, I only have older adults who've been living in Melbourne for more than 15 years, and they're all men.
Okay, so you should still try and get with the demographic, but you don't need to do the purposing because then that actually will tell you. Because then you can always go back and say, okay, well, we did have too many older, long-term male residents. So now we can test the hypothesis whether this is now another younger female.
Right. Well, purposive sampling would be the process by which you identify the subpopulations that you're interested in. So you do want to do purposive sampling, in that if you're targeting older males, you want to go find that's the if you're targeting younger females, you want to go and target that population. But it's because of your qualitative design rather than a need to represent the entirety of the population. Well, let's see if this answers any questions. All right. How do I make this? Let's see. Full screen. All right. Let's see if this works. It did. Okay, so some of this content comes from a lecture that I prepared in conjunction with Simon Carter, so that's why that's why I've got that little disclaimer. So I want to talk now about qualitative sampling and case studies, and next week we're going to get into surveys and interviews. So that discussion we had in the first hour, I'm not talking into anything, that's why I sound so not amplified. That conversation we had in the first hour was about quantitative studies. So spatial representativeness of your population, that's a quantitative idea. Qualitative research is something else. It is not about the yeses or nos, the hypothesis-driven work. It is about something other than quantification. So qualitative data seeks, well, not the data, but the qualitative research design seeks to explain. So it's not numerically driven. It's not yes or no. If you have a yes or no question, you probably have a quantitative question. If you have a why or a how, you probably have a quantitative question. So quantitative research, according to Breiman, is often much more about words and causality and reasons as opposed to just the existence and the demonstrability of something. So qualitative data can include all kinds of things. It can be words, what people say they think. It's hard to observe what people think. We have indicators for what people think. Words are one of those. But they can also draw pictures, or we can use images or site observations. So there are lots of other ways, especially in the built environment, to understand, to have qualitative data come to us. So qualitative data is characterized by often having very few observations. So we've just been talking about this process of representation. We don't need that in qualitative data necessarily, because qualitative work is not about representativeness. It's about those driving forces, the reasons and causal processes that underlie why something is happening. So Simon kind of said, oh, well, maybe qualitative research is not quantitative. And in other words, if you can't do what you're trying to do quantitatively, you might have a qualitative research process. It's typically about words, but it's also about more than words. What does that mean? We're going to go through a couple of examples, because I think, qualitative research, unlike quantitative research, where you can say you absolutely need a representative sample, you absolutely need to have a sample of a certain size, you absolutely need to control for bias. Qualitative work is much more subtle. When we start talking about it, we get a lot of, well, yeah, maybe that could probably work. Well, yeah, in certain cases that's going to be fine. In certain cases it's not going to be fine. It's much more artful. So in that sense, it fits snugly within a relativist way of knowing, a relativist ontology. In other words, it's not like the scientific, quasi-scientificness, the quasi-experimental nature of quantitative work, where if we design our experiment properly, at the end of the day, we're going to know something. We might not know anything at the end of a qualitative process, but we might. What's an ontology? It's how we see the world. What we call a world participating ontology, we can sometimes describe that as realism. World forming, an ontology, a way of knowing, a way of seeing the world. Sometimes we call that relativism. So we're going to talk about different examples of these. Epistemology is closely related to ontology. Epistemology is the idea of how we know what we know. So how do we know that we know something, as opposed to just think it? The theory of how knowledge is constructed is epistemology. So science is a way of knowing things. We have things that are observable. We study them under an experimental process. That is an epistemology. That is a certain kind of knowing that we think of as reasonable. But that's only been since the Enlightenment, only since the 1700s that the scientific process has really been widely thought to be credible. That scientific process, we often talk about it as an objective process. Anybody who's looking should be able to see it this way. But of course, for that, you have to buy into the epistemology of the scientific process. There are other epistemologies that, aside from scientific or experimental. So quantitative studies that fit into this objective category. But qualitative studies don't necessarily fit into that idea that there's only one way of knowing, and it's about designing an experiment and observing. The subjective epistemology says that we contribute to the knowledge about the subject. So not only do I interview the person, but I take what that person says and I filter it through my own mind and my own experience. And what comes out of that is something other than objective. It's got me in it. It's got me as the researcher in the product of the research through the analysis of the interviews. Now you could call that bias, and in an objective framework, you'd say, well, we're capable of removing the bias from our thoughts. That's the underlying premise of the scientific inquiry, that we humans are capable of removing ourselves and being an objective observer. Subjective work suggests something else, that we are actually not capable of that, or that we have a spectrum of capability to remove ourselves. And furthermore, that it's not necessary, that we can know things acknowledging the self as an agent of that knowledge. So qualitative research then fits into this world-forming ontology, this idea that we interpret the world, but we also make the world. We form the world, and we observe it. And those things are not in conflict with each other under a subjective ontology, or a subjective epistemology. So in that sense, qualitative research really often identifies with this idea of subjective knowledge formation rather than objective knowledge formation. That is hundreds of years of philosophy in one slide. For practical purposes, there's a great Neeraj, you took the subject. Is social? What's the subject in geography called? Social research methods. Fantastic subject where you spend the whole semester talking about epistemology and ontologies. It's fantastic. I've never taken it, but I've had students that do, and I'm always kind of drawing on what they know when they come back. The study of how we know what we know is especially now, I think it's very relevant to the kind of work we do. But we have to do many more things this semester, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on that. So I'll try to take those philosophical ideas of epistemology and ontology and relativism and subjectivism and objectivism and break them down into things you can do in research. So you have heard me talk about, you should never have can in your research question. But there are certain words that trigger qualitative or quantitative thoughts in examiners. So if we're looking at your thesis or looking at your methodology statement, words like how and why especially they really signal a qualitative process. Because you're not asking, does this thing exist in the world? You're asking, what is the driving force? Why does it behave this way? How does it work? And those are not questions that are easily get-atable, that are easily find-outable from a survey. Something else has to happen. You need deeper explanation, typically. So we're going to talk about case study methods and qualitative sampling today, the rest of the day, and maybe into a bit of next week. So if we think of case study research, we do have to start with how we decide what to study as we talk about sampling. If we think of case study research and we try to break it down into some sort of process map, it's kind of linear and it's kind of iterative. So we could put these balls, line them up left to right, but it wouldn't quite represent the qualitative process. So if I want to design a case study, I got to think about it. I'm going to plan. I go into a design phase. I prepare, and then I collect data. And at that point, I'm starting to collect data, right? And things happen. I observe things. I might have to go back and redesign. So it's not necessarily true that in a quantitative process, you plan, you design, you prepare, you collect, you analyze, and you share, and you're done. There's no second process. There's no redesign. Not usually. Not if you've done it right the first time. But with qualitative work, you are allowed to reflect on what's occurred and rethink it. Do I need more people who come from a different age category? Should I think about getting more people who ride the bikes? So there is this iterative process of redesign. And you might end up in this loop. Design, prepare, collect, for a while before you go down to analyze. And then as you analyze, you might design again. And then finally, you can share. So this is a process that kind of can be more iterative. And that learning process that occurs for the researcher is what drives how many iterations and how many times you change. So choosing a case study. So we've talked in past weeks when Leo did his study, he talked about why he chose his case study. But in general, a case study is basically just a study to understand some place or case or population or group. So it doesn't have to be a geographic case necessarily. In the built environment, we often do think about geography as a case study, Craigie-Byrne. But it could also be music venues, places that have live music, maybe in the inner suburbs. So there might be a geographic constraint and a non-geographic constraint. Might be just people, Melbourne University students who use the bike share program. So this is some sort of situation where we want information about something that's happening. The case study doesn't necessarily specify the kind of data you're using or how you might analyze it, but it is a really useful technique for exploratory research. So getting that case study right is really important so that you are sufficiently narrow to do something that you want to do and can do it well. According to Yin, her book's citation is in the end of the slides, but she says that a case study is an empirical inquiry that first investigates a phenomenon in depth within its real context. So that means that you don't have to isolate it, not like a laboratory condition where the experimenter takes the cells out of their normal environment and tests something on them. A case study is situated in the setting where it really exists. And in a case study, the boundaries between the thing we're trying to observe, the phenomenon, and the context are not clearly evident. That's why you can't have a laboratory condition. That's why you can't take the case out of the environment. Because in social processes, if you did that, there wouldn't be anything left. Or there might not be much left, and it certainly wouldn't tell us much. So a case study is very much situated in the real-life space that it's in. So when do we use a case study? We use it when we have questions like how or why, but not generally questions starting with what. So what do people want? What are people thinking? What proportion of people feel a certain way? Those are not times when qualitative research is useful, and they're not times when case studies are useful. They're useful when we want to explore behaviors. So when we want to understand why in his natural environment does Neeraj do something, right? Then that's a time for a case study, as opposed to manipulating the environment and seeing whether something happens, which is much more of an experimental case. So the quasi-experimental design is a bit of an overlap, right? We kind of manipulate the environment. We didn't actually manipulate it, but it was manipulated in the Activity Centers project, in the Parks project. Something manipulated the environment, and we observed it. That's a quasi-experimental process. But it's not an experimental process. So it's not a clear-cut thing, but case studies are very much situated in no manipulation of the process or very little manipulation of the process. Now, sometimes the researcher can't help but manipulate the process by virtue of being there. So case studies then are quite useful for things that are occurring now, because we can actually be there to observe the process. Historians do work where they're looking at prior events through the written and sometimes historical, like oral record. But older events so things that have happened in the past can also be studied via case study method if there's a record or a memory. Back to this idea of a case study. So a case study is different than, say, an ethnography. So Leo also talked about ethnographies. Case studies can be very bird's eye view. So the researcher is removed sometimes from the context or situation. And in that case, the study design is driven by a context. So the researcher draws boundaries around the context. Kind of says, all right, there's something going on here. I'm going to go through a few case study designs for you. And then this term thick description gets used a lot. So instead of trying to isolate the event that's occurring, we try to isolate the event plus all the stuff that could possibly influence it. And then we try to get data. And this thick description is our process of getting data. We need data that not only tells us about the thing that's happening, but also all the context that feeds into it, all the context that influences it and could explain it. So, in qualitative research, we still have issues of reliability and validity. Breiman calls these quality measures. So he talks about trustworthiness, credibility, which comes to this idea of internal validity. How credible is what we've done? How well constructed were the instruments? How did the questions we asked actually get us toward what we want to know? Transferability. Can we transfer this to another setting or another population or another group? So that's an external validity argument. Dependability. That's reliability. So how much can we depend on these results to actually represent what's occurring? And confirmability. Can we do it again? If I spell out my process sufficiently, can some other researcher come back and do it again and try to and get the same results? Is it confirmable? So the authenticity of the research is really a compilation of this trustworthiness. So Breiman gives us a lot of, there is a parallel language between qualitative and quantitative study. It's parallel, but it's not the same. So we've talked about internal and external validity. We've talked about reliability. We've talked about this idea that objectivity and how that works in quantitative research, that there's a world out there to be observed and that we are capable of doing that, and how that relates to epistemology. But these are parallel, but they're not exactly the same thing. So qualitative research is toward this conversation about what these mean. It's very different because qualitative research is coming from a different way of knowing. It's all very abstract, isn't it? So there are some criticisms of qualitative research. I've experienced this myself when I've presented qualitative research to people who wanted quantitative research. So I've found this to be true when in dealing with local governments, for instance, where they're used to having dots on maps. And they want a dot on a map. And when we try to explain something that's more contextual, it's very hard for them to get behind it. So one of the powers of objective quantitative data and analysis is that it aligns with the worldview, the objectivist worldview. And most people believe that that is a valid way of knowing. And the qualitative case study, one thing we heard over and over again was these findings lack rigor. There are only 55 interviews. They're not representative of the entire population. That's true. They aren't. But we have to remember that that comes from a certain worldview about what knowledge is. So this common criticism that they lack rigor. The Yin answers that by saying that there is a lack of methodological texts that explain qualitative research. So it's really hard to explain qualitative research to people. And we try to break it down and here, and I'm giving you a lot of really abstract theory, and after this I'll go into some examples of what's been done. But if you ever tried to do qualitative research, you'll find, or when you try to do it, you'll find that you learn it by doing it. So it's very hard to explain it. Whereas explaining quantitative research is quite easy in a lot of ways because you just go through your process and when you're done, you're done. So one thing that I've been accused of, maybe not intentionally, nobody ever said, Jenny, you absolutely did this, but the suggestion is that we've cherry-picked evidence because we want to find something. So we've gone and found the people who are going to support our assertion and interviewed them and gotten some biased results. Now, that is also possible in quantitative work. But for some reason, people don't get hung up on it like they do with small sample case study methods. Possibly because we think that because all this rigorous process exists to get our sampling right, that we don't have cherry-picking problems. We don't have bias problems. We know that we do, and that we do what we can to, an ethical researcher will do what she can to try to eliminate those biases or reduce them. But a truly ethical researcher will also know that it's very difficult to do, and that she or he brings subjectiveness to the process that adds bias we don't even understand. So another criticism we get of case studies is that they're not generalizable. It's hard to talk about the Docklands and then use that information in any other context because the Docklands is just its own thing and every place is very, very, all places are different from each other. So this idea of generalizability, it's true. Case studies are reflective of a particular phenomenon in a particular time in a particular place. And they do often lack generalizableness outside of that place. So we do need to keep this in mind. How generalizable is our place? If you could do demographic matching and find that the place is very similar to 10 other places and infer that there's something generalizable there. But that's not the only criteria for generalizability. So a counter consideration might be that we do generalize the results of a single scientific experiment. We feel that those are generalizable to other situations, other people. And that has also been contested. Lots of medical studies are done on certain populations and not on others. And so the effectiveness on those other populations of certain drugs might not be well represented in the studies. So another criticism that case studies get is that they lack containment and discipline. So they take a long time, they're tedious, they dwell in far too much detail, they're a struggle to understand, and it can also be true that they require complex explanations. So if you're going into case study work, you might want to be ready for, people will say things like, can't you make the results simpler? Well, you might not be able to. It might not be simple. So you've got to be ready to stand for the idea that there is just enough detail to understand. And any less detail will require you to understand less. And that there are some human processes which are not distillable into very parsimonious, simple explanations. So, units of analysis in case studies. Units of analysis are the link between the phenomenon of interest, the thing that you're trying to understand, and your context. I'm just going to go forward a little bit to my Anna Rose thesis on docklands and placemaking. So, for example, Anna was interested in this idea of placemaking and so she was interested in this phenomenon of how do people perceive place. And she chose the area of the docklands. And the reason she did that is because she thought of it as a kind of interesting, exceptional place where placemaking, having a sense of place is going to be a struggle. It's going to be composed differently here in the docklands than in lots of other places. So how interesting is it to study it? And she was looking particularly at a program called the Docklands Spaces. This was a trend. Have you heard of the Renew Newcastle program happening? So this is a placemaking kind of program that they started by a guy named Marcus Westbury in Newcastle, and there were lots of little things like. But one of the initiatives was allowing small shops to move into vacant shop fronts for short leases. So there was a Docklands Spaces, which was a takeoff of that, where makers, people and small businesses were permitted to move into some of these very high-end ground floor spaces in some of the Docklands buildings, and be in residency there for a few months, and then they had to move out. So I think it was 3-month leases. And so there was this short blip of these interesting businesses occupying the ground floor of some what would normally be a very high-end restaurant or something. And the idea was, okay, well, we don't have a lot of we have a lot of vacancies in these commercial spaces. Let's see if it produces more sense of place. So Anna had to conceive of this idea of sense of place, and what does that mean? And then she went out and interviewed people who lived in the Docklands, and she found that they didn't even notice the businesses. So what she was trying to understand was whether or not the Docklands Spaces program had any impact on how people constructed their idea of a sense of place. And she imagined that her qualitative hypothesis was that she'd go out there and people would be like, oh yeah, these businesses moved in, and then I felt more like I was in a real neighborhood, and I started hanging out more at the restaurants, and now I feel like I live in a place. And what she actually found out was they were like, what? There were businesses in the ground floor spaces? I didn't even notice. I just go to the parking garage and I leave. So she didn't find this. But she found instead that there was this, the construction of place in the Docklands was very different. That people didn't follow a normal sort of placemaking, access, linkages, comfort, activities, sociability. Rather, they saw Docklands as something else, more like a bedroom community, a place where they could be temporarily while being close to something else. So the value for them was not in the place itself, but its proximity to other places, like the CBD. So I'm going back to the unit of analysis. The phenomenon of interest for Anna was placemaking. The unit of analysis for her was the people who lived in the Docklands. So she could have just as easily studied businesses or something else. But inside, so the phenomenon of interest is there. She accessed that phenomenon of interest, that placemaking, through the units of analysis, residents. And inside of those units of analysis, the residents, sit inside of a context. The Docklands is different than Fitzroy. It's different than Carlton. It's got something else going on. It's got a lot of big empty space. It's new. It's got a lot of high-rise buildings. It's got bigger spaces. It's closer to the CBD. So she really had to distinguish what she was interested in from the units that she was looking at to try to understand her case. And there can be more than one unit of analysis in a study, but for Anna's case, there was just the one, people, residents of the Dockland. So it's really important to not get any of these things confused. Your case is composed of all of these things, but they sit inside of each other. The thing you're studying is embodied, is enmeshed in that context. The unit of analysis has that phenomenon of interest inside of it, and it's your job to try to figure out how it works. So there are multiple different kinds of case studies. So we can have just one case, a single case design. That was Anna's study. We can have multiple cases. So this is a context with 4 different cases. We can have a 2-unit of analysis. So this is called a multiple unit of analysis, or an embedded study. So I might be studying 2 different populations in the same case. People who drive away and don't notice the ground floor versus people who stay and feel a sense of place. And I can have multiple case, multiple units of analysis studies. But when you're identifying what you're doing, it's a really good idea to get a handle on, do I have a single case? If I'm doing a multiple case, why? What does that multiple case get me? Because I'm obviously comparing something to something else, but what's the usefulness of that? So every time you move up in complexity, You want to be able to justify. Why do I need 2 or 4 contexts? Why is it not sufficient to look at one context? What does the comparison achieve? Many very good master's and doctoral theses and published work sits in this single case study. Single cases can be really interesting because sometimes sometimes we choose single cases because they're representative, but we often do multiple case designs for that reason too. But sometimes we do single case studies because they're really weird. Like something's happened and it's weird. Whoa, why did this community organize like that? What happened here? So when we're choosing a case study, it might be that we're looking at a place that did something extraordinary, extraordinarily good or extraordinarily bad, or just interesting, and go, oh, what happened here? Why did this place turn out this way? Those are the kinds of questions that are really meaningful for case study research. Yin guides us to 3 stages of research. So she says define and design as a first stage, prepare, collect, and analyze, and then more analyze and conclude. So it starts with a theory, selecting your cases, and designing your data collection protocol, and then collecting data. She encourages us to write individual case reports for each case study, and then develop cross-case conclusions, modify a theory if we need to, develop our policy implications, and write our whole big report that synthesizes all 3 of the individual case reports. So if we're doing multiple case reports, we don't just put it all together all at once. We have to understand each individual case on its own, inside of its own context, and then explain it inside of the other, in comparison to the others. So, cases are still requiring of us to select sampling. Sampling is different in qualitative studies and quantitative studies. So random sampling, again, that's something that's kind of associated with quantitative studies. In qualitative studies, we often use what we call purposive sampling. So rather than sampling for representativeness on a space or of a population, purposiveness is another way to say it's non-random. It's not exactly the same as quantitative sampling. So you might select on certain characteristics. I'm interested in older adults' travel patterns. So those characteristics will decide who belongs in your sample. And it can also be about things that aren't people. So it can be about where they live, their space, the environments or the infrastructure that surrounds them. So Breiman gives us a whole list of sampling techniques, and I've selected a few for this. So if we're choosing a case and we're choosing which unit of analysis to sample, one reason that we'll select is an extreme or a deviant case. So participants in that extreme or deviant case might be positioned on a spectrum of extremeness or deviance. But individuals are one part of our case. But we might want to select on things that are kind of unusual or abnormal. So there are studies of sociopaths, right? People who have sociopathy as a personality feature. Right? So you can actually select deviant people who are different than normal. Normal is one of those words that's, if 3 to 4% of people are sociopaths, then that's not abnormal per se. It's a thing that exists in our population. But unusualness is some reason why we might select. Now, we don't always know. Sometimes Anna didn't go into her study in the Docklands saying, the Docklands is unusual from a placemaking perspective. So she had a hypothesis that placemaking there was what might have occurred out of this program that she observed. She didn't know that, but she did know that the Docklands was an unusual place from an urban fabric perspective. And so she did, one reason she selected the place was because the case was extreme, it was deviant. But then from inside of that, she didn't select extreme or deviant people. She just tried to select people who would participate in her study. So when we sample, we might look also for participants that are extreme or deviant. We might also look, so here's another example. This is Wellington Street, Neil Street. This is Wellington, New Zealand. And there are some really interesting playgrounds where positioned relative to social housing estates. So, oh no, sorry, this is Neil Street, Carlton. This is Georgia Wellington's thesis. So this playground, this is adjacent to the Rathdown Street estate and positioned close to two other housing estates, but surrounded otherwise by very high-end housing. So she picked these playgrounds because they were interesting and deviant. In other words, they are in an unusual place. Lots of playgrounds sit inside of an urban fabric in a continuous neighborhood. But this is a place where people who live in housing estates mix with people who live in the surrounding very high-end housing, or very expensive housing. So the selection of the playground was because this place is unusual. So the case can be something about the case can make it interesting for us to look at. And that produces a context that might tell us something about what it means when social groups mix. This is another one of her playgrounds. So this is there are a couple of housing estates and then an adjacent playground, again surrounded by inner city, quite higher end housing. And this is the title of her thesis, which I quite liked. The micropolitics and everyday encounter with difference. So we will need to stop there. Next week, we're going to get into the more about qualitative sampling, including typical cases. So have a good week, and I will see you next week.
Why can I make it? Because right now people only focusing on Komodo National Park, but actually I want to compare